Some people run from danger, but I've always run toward it. Firefighting isn't just my job, it's who I am. For years, I thought I had it all: a job I loved, a wife I trusted, and a life that felt solid. But fire has a way of showing you the truth, burning away what you thought was safe. Now I'm standing in the middle of the wreckage, trying to figure out how everything started falling apart. For me, being a firefighter isn't just about saving lives, it's about the rush, the risk, the purpose. I've pulled people out of burning buildings, faced walls of smoke, and walked away from fires that could have taken me down. It's dangerous, yeah, but I can't imagine doing anything else. Outside of work, I had Emily, my wife of over a decade, my anchor. She's an anesthesiologist, smart, calm under pressure, the kind of person who could ground me when the chaos of my job got too much. She was my rock, the one person who made me feel invincible. At least, that's what I thought, until everything started changing. Lately, something has gone wrong. I can't even put my finger on when it started. Maybe a few months ago. Emily's been distracted. She forgets things she never would have before, like our weekly takeout night or asking how my shift went. She's been coming home late more often, saying she's swamped at work or that an emergency surgery came up. I know her job is demanding, but it's like she's not really here even when she's sitting right next to me. The way she used to light up when she saw me walk through the door, that's gone. At first, I told myself it was nothing. She works long hours just like I do. But then little things started piling up, like how she started pulling her phone closer when she was texting as if she didn't want me to see, or how she'd trail off mid-conversation, her mind clearly somewhere else. The kicker came last week when my buddy Mark, who works downtown, casually mentioned seeing Emily near Union Square late at night. She was with some guy, he said offhand, like he didn't think much of it. Figured it was a work thing. I laughed it off at the time, made some joke about her probably needing to vent about her crazy coworkers. But after that, I couldn't shake the thought. Emily never mentioned being downtown that night, and if it was work-related, why wouldn't she say something? Still, I brushed it aside. I mean, it's Emily. We've been through everything together. There's no way she'd... No, I'm overthinking it, right? But no matter how much I tell myself to let it go, there's this tiny voice in the back of my head. It's whispering questions I don't want to answer. What if there's something she's not telling me? What if things aren't as perfect as I thought? That night, lying awake next to her, I stared at the ceiling, trying to drown out that voice. But the doubt was there now, a tiny ember smoldering in the dark. And if there's one thing I've learned about fire, it's that even the smallest spark can grow into something unstoppable. The fire had been a bad one of those sprawling warehouse blazes that eats up everything in its path, turning steel and concrete into a furnace hotter than hell itself. A collapsing beam caught me, off guard, pinning my leg before my crew could pull me out. The paramedics strapped me to a stretcher, and before I knew it, I was on my way to the ER. Pain blurred everything, but the thought of Emily waiting for me kept me steady. She'd be there, like she always was, her hands soft and steady, her voice calm as she reassured me. When I came to in the hospital bed, she was already there. But something was different. She wasn't holding my hand or fussing over me like she usually did. Instead, she stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, a tight smile plastered on her face. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her tone flat. "Been better?" I joked, trying to lighten the mood. She nodded, her eyes flicking to the monitor beside me. "You're stable. The doctor said it's a clean break. Nothing too complicated." That was it. No, "Thank God you're okay," no tears of relief, not even a kiss on the forehead. Just clinical facts, like she was reading from a chart. "You all right?" I asked, frowning. She blinked, caught off guard. "What? Yeah, of course. Why wouldn't I be?" I didn't know how to answer that. Something felt off, but maybe I was overthinking it. She worked in the same hospital after all. Maybe this was her professional side kicking in. I told myself she was just in work mode, that she'd let her guard down once we got home, but the shift never came. In the days that followed, her detachment lingered like a shadow. She wasn't cold exactly. She still asked if I needed anything, still brought me coffee in the mornings while I hobbled around on crutches, but it felt distant, like she was going through the motions without really being there. The cracks widened one night when I caught her on the couch, scrolling through her phone. I limped into the room, and she jumped, locking the screen so quickly it might as well have been reflex. "What's that about?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She laughed, a little too loud. "Nothing. Just talking to Sarah. Girl stuff, you know." "Uh-huh." I leaned on the back of the couch, watching her closely. "Since when do you hide girl stuff from me?" Her smile tightened and she shrugged. "It's not a big deal, really. She's going through something and I promised to keep it between us." I wanted to believe her. Hell, I did believe her. But there was something in her eyes, something guarded, like she was daring me to push further. I let it drop, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. A few nights later, I couldn't sleep. The ache in my leg was part of it, but my mind wouldn't settle either. Around 2 a.m., I got up and decided to go for a drive. It was something I'd done for years to clear my head. I grabbed my keys and stepped outside, only to freeze on the porch. Emily's car wasn't there. At first, I thought maybe she was on call. She'd mentioned something about taking extra shifts to cover for a coworker. But when I opened the app on my phone to check the hospital's schedule, something she'd shared with me for emergencies, I didn't see her name listed. A sick feeling started to creep in as I pulled out of the driveway. I didn't have a destination in mind, but as I cruised through town, I found myself scanning parking lots and side streets looking for her car. I told myself I was being ridiculous, paranoid. There had to be a reasonable explanation. And then I saw it. Her car was parked in front of a diner on the edge of town, the kind of place that's mostly empty at this hour. I pulled into a spot across the street and sat there staring. My heart was pounding, and my palms were slick on the steering wheel. I didn't know what I was expecting to see. Maybe she was grabbing a coffee before heading back to the hospital. Maybe she was meeting a coworker to go over some urgent case notes. Maybe the diner's door swung open and she stepped out. She wasn't alone. A man followed her, walking close enough that their arms nearly touched. I couldn't make out much in the dim light, but they were talking, heads tilted toward each other in that familiar, intimate way. I clenched the steering wheel, my breath shallow. What the hell was this? They walked to their cars and I prayed they'd go their separate ways. But they didn't. Her car stayed parked as he leaned against his, laughing at something she said. Then he reached out, touching her arm, and she didn't pull away. I didn't wait to see more. My stomach churned as I sped away, my mind racing. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe it was a colleague, and I was blowing things out of proportion. But deep down, I knew better. The cracks in the glass weren't just showing. They were spreading. And sooner or later, the whole thing was going to shatter. At the firehouse, downtime is rare, but when it happens, the guys don't waste a second filling it with chatter. Work, sports, family, you name it. But lately, one topic kept surfacing like an annoying fly you can't swat away. Man, you ever notice how those OR docs and nurses are practically married to each other? One of the guys, Danny, said, leaning back in his chair. All that time together locked away from the rest of the hospital? It's like a breeding ground for drama. I forced a laugh, focusing on polishing my helmet. Come on, man. That's just soap opera talk. Danny shrugged, smirking. Maybe. But my cousin's wife works in an OR and she says it's true. Long shifts, high stress, it's like the perfect storm for hookups. The others chimed in, tossing around stories they'd heard, each one more absurd than the last. I tried to tune them out, but their words clung to me like smoke. I didn't want to think about it. Didn't want to picture Emily in that environment, surrounded by people who shared her world in ways I never could. But the image was there now, unwanted and stubborn, like an ember refusing to die. The next few days I couldn't shake it. Every time I saw her texting with that guarded look on her face, or heard her mention another late-night surgery, my chest tightened. I told myself I was being stupid. She was my wife. Emily wasn't like that. She'd never, would she? One night she came home later than usual, her scrubs wrinkled and her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She dropped her bag by the door and sighed, rubbing her neck. "Long night?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She nodded, heading straight for the kitchen. "Yeah, emergency surgery ran over. I barely had time to breathe." I followed her, leaning against the counter. "You should have called." I was starting to worry. She grabbed a glass of water, avoiding my eyes. "Sorry, I didn't think about it. It was nonstop chaos." Her explanation made sense, but something about her felt off. Her voice was too steady, too rehearsed. Or maybe I was just imagining things. The final straw came a few nights later. Emily was scheduled for a night shift, one of those grueling 12-hour marathons she always complained about. She kissed me on the cheek before leaving, her smile faint, but warm. "I'll see you in the morning," she said, grabbing her keys. "Be careful," I replied, watching her walk out the door. For hours I tried to distract myself. I cleaned the kitchen, flipped through channels, even tried working on the Mustang, but nothing stuck. That ember of doubt had grown into a spark, and it wouldn't let me rest. Around midnight, I made a decision. Grabbing my jacket, I headed to the car. If she was at work like she said, I'd feel like an idiot for doubting her. But if she wasn't, the drive to the hospital was short, but it felt like forever. When I pulled into the parking lot, my stomach was in knots. I scanned the rows of cars looking for hers, but it wasn't there. For a moment, I sat there, staring at the empty space where her car should have been. My mind raced with excuses. Maybe she parked somewhere else. Maybe she got a ride with a coworker. Maybe I pulled out my phone and dialed her number. It rang twice before she picked up. "Hey," she said, her voice low. "Hey, how's your shift going?" I asked, keeping my tone light. There was a slight pause. "Busy. I just got out of the OR. Why?" I clenched the steering wheel, forcing myself to stay calm. "No reason. Just wanted to check in." "Oh, well, thanks." She sounded distracted, almost rushed. "I should get back. See you in the morning?" "Yeah, see you." She hung up before I could say anything else. I sat there in the dark, the phone still in my hand, my heart pounding. Something wasn't right. Her voice. It didn't sound like it usually did. There was no background noise, no hum of hospital machinery or chatter from the nurse's station. Just silence. I didn't know where she was or what she was doing, but one thing was clear. She wasn't where she said she'd be, and the spark of doubt was now a full-fledged flame, burning hotter with every passing second. The unease in my chest had turned into something heavier, something that felt like it might crush me if I didn't get answers soon. Emily's words, her late nights, the way she clung to her phone, it all swirled in my head like smoke in a burning building. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, and it was eating me alive. After that night at the hospital, I knew I couldn't just sit around waiting for the truth to fall into my lap. I needed proof, answers. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I downloaded a tracking app. The decision wasn't easy. I sat there staring at my phone for what felt like an hour before finally hitting download. It felt wrong, like I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But then I thought about the way she'd avoided my questions, the way she'd lied about being at work. If she wasn't going to tell me the truth, I had to find it myself. It wasn't hard to set up. I already knew her phone password, something we'd shared for emergencies. Once the app was installed, I felt a strange mix of guilt and relief. Guilt because I was spying on my wife, relief because finally I might get some clarity. The next morning, Emily left the house earlier than usual. She kissed me goodbye, her lips brushing my cheek, and muttered something about needing to prep for a busy day. I nodded, forcing a smile, but my gut told me she wasn't heading to the hospital. I waited until she was out of the driveway before opening the app. My heart raced as the little icon on the map began to move. She was driving west, away from the hospital. I told myself to calm down. Maybe she was running an errand, picking up coffee or dropping off something for a friend. There had to be a reasonable explanation, but when the icon stopped, it wasn't at a coffee shop or a friend's house. It was in a part of town we rarely visited, outside a small cafe tucked into the corner of a strip mall. I grabbed my keys and headed out, my pulse pounding in my ears. The drive felt endless, every stoplight dragging on longer than it should. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, my hands were shaking. Her car was there, parked near the entrance. I parked a few rows back, out of sight, and watched. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe she was meeting a coworker for breakfast before her shift. Maybe she was catching up with an old friend. Maybe the door to the cafe opened, and Emily stepped out. She wasn't alone. A man followed her, tall with a trimmed beard and a confident gait. He walked close to her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. She laughed at something he said, the sound carrying across the lot like a punch to my gut. I sank lower in my seat, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. They stopped by her car, leaning against the hood as they talked. She smiled at him, really smiled, the way she used to smile at me. I wanted to get out of the car, to march over there and demand an explanation. But my feet felt glued to the floor, my body frozen with disbelief. As I watched them, 100 thoughts raced through my mind. Was this just a coworker, a friend? Was I reading too much into this? But then he reached out, brushing her arm with his hand, and she didn't pull away. That single gesture broke something in me. It wasn't definitive proof of anything, but it felt like confirmation. My doubts, my suspicions, they weren't just paranoia. Something was happening. Something she hadn't told me. They talked for a few more minutes before he opened the door to his car, and she waved him off with a soft smile. I waited until she pulled out of the lot and drove away before starting my car. I didn't follow her. I couldn't. My head was spinning, my chest tight with a mix of anger and hurt. I didn't want to believe what I'd just seen, but the image of them standing there, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world, was burned into my mind. By the time I got home, the anger had started to simmer into something darker. I knew I couldn't confront her yet, not without real proof. But I couldn't ignore what I'd seen either. That ember of doubt had grown into a flame, and it was spreading fast. Emily mentioned the conference a week in advance, almost like she wanted to plant the seed early. It's just a couple of days, she said over dinner, barely looking up from her plate. A lot of big names in anesthesiology are going to be there. It's a great opportunity. I nodded, chewing my steak. Where's it at? Some hotel out near Saratoga. I'll text you the details once I get the itinerary. Her words felt rehearsed, like she'd been practicing them in her head. But I forced myself to nod, to smile, to play along like everything was fine. Sounds good. Let me know if you need help packing. She laughed at that, brushing off the offer with a quick, I've got it covered. When the day of the conference came, I kissed her goodbye at the door, watching as she carried her overnight bag to the car. Call me when you get there, I said, trying to keep my tone casual. Of course, she replied, smiling over her shoulder. Love you. Love. You too. The words felt hollow. As soon as she pulled out of the driveway, I opened the tracking app on my phone. The little icon blinked to life, and I stared at the screen as her car headed north. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. She was sticking to the highway, following the route she'd mentioned. But then the icon veered off. I frowned, refreshing the map to make sure it wasn't a glitch. The tracker showed her car pulling off the highway and heading west away from Saratoga. My pulse quickened as I watched her drive through a small town and into a more remote area. Then the icon stopped. I zoomed in on the map, my stomach twisting as I read the name of the location. A motel. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, my mind racing. Maybe she stopped for gas. Maybe she needed a break. Maybe. I grabbed my keys and headed to the car. The drive felt like it lasted forever, each mile stretching out longer than the last. My thoughts were a mess, flipping between denial and anger. By the time I pulled into the motel's gravel parking lot, my hands were shaking. Her car was there. I parked a few spaces down, my heart pounding as I stared at her car. There was no mistaking it. The same little sticker in the rear window, the same scuff on the bumper from that time she backed into a pole. I sat there for a minute, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Every instinct in me screamed to go home, to turn around and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I couldn't. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under my boots as I made my way to the front desk. The clerk barely looked up from his phone as I approached. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for someone," I said, my voice tight. "She checked in earlier today. Emily, blonde, about this tall." He raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Sorry, man. Can't give out guest info." I pulled out my wallet, sliding a 20 across the counter. "I'm not asking for her social security number. Just tell me if she's here." He hesitated, then shrugged. "Room 214. I didn't thank him. The walk to the second floor felt like a death march. My chest was tight, my head buzzing. When I reached the door, I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the numbers. I raised my hand to knock, but stopped short when I heard voices inside. Her voice and his. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, soft, intimate. Something inside me snapped. I stepped back and walked away. I didn't trust myself to open that door, to face whatever was on the other side. I didn't want to see it, didn't want to hear it. If I walked in there, I knew I'd lose whatever control I had left. The drive home was a blur. My hands shook on the wheel, my mind a storm of anger and hurt. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the rage had settled into something darker, an emptiness that swallowed everything else. I sat on the couch for hours, staring at nothing, the weight of what I'd seen crushing me. She came home just after midnight, her bag slung over her shoulder, her face lighting up when she saw me. "Hey," she said, setting her bag down. "I didn't think you'd still be up." I stared at her, my jaw tight. "How was the conference?" She froze for half a second, just long enough for me to catch it, before forcing a smile. "Good. Long, but good." I stood, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "Cut the crap, Emily. I know where you were." Her smile faltered, her eyes wide. "What are you talking about?" "I saw you," I said, my voice rising, "at the motel, with him." Her face went pale, and for a moment she didn't say anything. Then she shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's not what you think." "Don't lie to me," I snapped. "I followed you, Emily. I saw everything." She broke, then, collapsing onto the couch as the tears spilled over. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." I stood there, staring at her, waiting for her to say something that would make it all make sense. "It was a mistake," she said, sobbing now. "I've just been so lonely. You're always at work, always putting your life on the line. And I just needed someone to talk to." Her words cut deeper than I thought possible. The woman I'd built my life around, the woman I'd trusted with everything, had betrayed me. And now here she was, crying and apologizing, like that could fix it. I didn't say anything. I just walked out of the room, leaving her there in tears. Emily's sobs echoed through the house long after I left the room. I sat in the garage, slumped on the old couch near my Mustang, the space usually my escape from the world. But even here, the weight of what had happened followed me. Her apologies, her excuses, they replayed in my mind. Louder than the buzz of the fluorescent light overhead, she'd tried to explain. Between tears and choked words, she told me it wasn't what I thought, that he was a coworker, someone who understood her in ways she thought I couldn't, that it had started innocently, long conversations during breaks at work, until it became something more. It wasn't real, she'd said, her voice cracking. He manipulated me, made me feel like he was the only one who understood how hard things were. But it wasn't love. It was never love. Her words were hollow, excuses that bounced off me without landing. Manipulated? Understood? What about us? What about the life we'd built together, the years of laughter, the promises we'd made? I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing in that parking lot with him, smiling like he was the only thing that mattered. I ran a hand through my hair, staring at the Mustang's hood, the car we'd spent months rebuilding together. Emily had never been into cars, but she'd always supported my passion, handing me tools and laughing when I got too grease-covered to touch her. The memories hit hard, each one sharper than the last. The first time I saw her, our wedding day, the mornings we'd spent tangled in each other's arms, whispering promises about a future we thought was unbreakable. Those memories should have brought comfort, but now they felt like a cruel joke. Every good moment we'd shared was tainted by the knowledge of what she'd done. How do you reconcile love with betrayal? How do you hold on to the good when the bad overshadows it all? I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I felt like a ghost, my body moving on autopilot as I showered and left the house. Emily tried to stop me as I walked out the door, her eyes swollen and red. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Out," I said, not turning back. I ended up at Mark's place, one of my oldest friends and a fellow firefighter. He opened the door, took one look at me, and stepped aside without a word. We sat in his kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. I told him everything: the conference, the tracking app, the motel, her tears, her excuses. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with every word. "Man, that's rough," he finally said, leaning back in his chair. "I don't even know what to say." "Yeah," I muttered, staring into my coffee. "You still love her?" The question caught me off guard. I looked up at him, then back at the mug in my hands. "I don't know," I admitted. "I think so. But it doesn't matter, does it? She betrayed me. How do you come back from that?" Mark shrugged. "I don't know if you can. But if you're not sure, don't make any decisions yet. Take some time. Figure out what you really want." I nodded, his words settling somewhere deep in my chest. It wasn't much, but it was something to hold on to. When I got home, Emily was waiting for me. She looked like she hadn't moved since I left, her face pale and streaked with dried tears. "I thought you weren't coming back," she whispered. I dropped my keys on the counter and sighed. "I'm here." She stepped closer, her hands trembling as she reached for me. "Please, just give me a chance. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Therapy, quitting my job, anything. I'll cut him out of my life. I already have. It's over, I swear. Just don't leave me." Her desperation was heartbreaking, but it only made the ache in my chest worse. I wanted to grab her, to hold her and tell her we'd be okay. But I couldn't. Not yet. "I need time," I said, stepping back. Her face crumpled, but she nodded. "Okay. However long you need." That night I packed a bag and left. I didn't tell her where I was going, and she didn't ask. As I drove to a motel on the other side of town, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief because I finally had space to think. Sadness because the home we'd built together, the life we'd shared, now felt like a distant memory. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. Love alone wasn't enough to heal the wounds she'd left behind. Living alone again felt like stepping into a different life, one I hadn't lived in over a decade. The motel room was small and impersonal, just a bed, a table, and a television that buzzed faintly whenever it was on. It wasn't home, but in some ways it was easier than going back to the house Emily and I had built together. The silence gave me space to think, though I wasn't always sure I wanted it. Without the usual distractions of work or Emily's presence, memories kept creeping in, uninvited. I thought about how I'd wake up to the smell of coffee she'd brewed just the way I liked it, or the way she used to laugh at my dumb jokes even when they weren't funny. I remembered the nights we stayed up late planning trips we never took, dreams we never got around to chasing. But the same silence that brought those memories also brought clarity. I began to notice things about my life, things I'd ignored for too long. I realized how much of myself I'd given to my job, to the adrenaline and the chaos, leaving Emily with the pieces of me I was too tired to hold on to. I wondered if that's what had left her vulnerable, even though it didn't excuse what she'd done. The distance between us didn't stop her from reaching out. She called almost every night, leaving voicemails when I didn't pick up. Sometimes, she'd just say she missed me. Other times, she'd apologize again, begging me to come home. I'd listen to her words, feel the ache in her voice, but I never called back. Then one day, something shifted. It started with a call from an old friend of mine, Jake, who worked at the hospital where Emily and her coworker, him, were employed. Jake and I weren't particularly close, but we'd kept in touch over the years. "Hey, man," he said, his voice cautious. "I heard about everything that happened. I'm sorry you're going through this." "Thanks," I said flatly, not wanting to talk about it. "I thought you should know something," he continued. "The guy Emily was involved with, you're not the first. He's got a reputation around here. He's done this before, with other women, married ones." I sat up straighter. "What do you mean?" Jake sighed. "He's a predator. He finds women who are stressed, vulnerable, and he plays the understanding coworker until he gets what he wants. Then he moves on. Everyone knows it, but no one's ever done anything about it." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. For weeks, I'd been drowning in anger and betrayal, blaming Emily entirely for what happened. But now, the picture started to change. She wasn't innocent. She'd made her choices, but she hadn't been the only one at fault. After the call ended, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Jake's words replayed in my head, each one stirring up a mix of anger and resolve. This guy had taken advantage of her, of multiple women, and no one had stopped him. I decided I couldn't let that stand. I spent the next few days digging. I talked to Jake, to others at the hospital, quietly piecing together the stories of the women he'd hurt. It wasn't hard to find them. His pattern was obvious once you knew what to look for. Late-night messages, convenient confessions about his own struggles. Little touches that seemed innocent at first but weren't. With the evidence I'd gathered, I compiled a report and sent it directly to the hospital's HR department. I didn't do it for Emily. Not entirely. I did it because I couldn't stand the thought of him preying on someone else, of another husband sitting in my position, wondering where things had gone so wrong. The hospital acted quickly. Within a week, he was under investigation, and a few days later, he was gone. They didn't say much about the outcome, corporate confidentiality and all that, but I heard enough to know he wouldn't be coming back. The relief I felt was fleeting. I'd done what I could to stop him, but it didn't fix the hole in my chest or the cracks in my marriage. Emily called me the day she found out he'd been fired. "I heard what you did," she said quietly. "Thank you." I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. She kept trying, though. Over the next few weeks, she sent me messages, apologizing again, asking me to meet with her. She said she'd started seeing a therapist, that she was working on herself, that she'd do anything to make things right. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't go back. Trust wasn't something you could glue back together once it was shattered. Every time I looked at her, I'd see that parking lot. Every time she smiled at me, I'd wonder if she'd smiled at him the same way. The love I felt for her was still there, buried under the pain and the anger. But love wasn't enough. Not anymore. One night, as I sat alone in the motel room, I finally replied to one of her messages. "I need more time," I wrote. "Please stop calling." Her response came almost instantly. "Okay, I'm sorry. Take all the time you need." As I set the phone down, a strange sense of calm settled over me. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't rebuild what we'd lost until I figured out who I was without her. And, for the first time in weeks, that felt like a step in the right direction. The decision to divorce wasn't something I came to lightly. It felt like trying to tear out a piece of myself, knowing it would leave a scar that might never fully heal. For weeks, I went back and forth, weighing every memory, every possibility. Could we rebuild? Could I ever trust her again? In the end, the answer was no. When I finally told Emily, it was one of the hardest conversations of my life. We met at a park we used to go to when we first started dating, a quiet place where we'd spent hours talking about our dreams for the future. It felt fitting in a way to end things where they'd begun. She sat across from me on the weathered bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I could see the hope in her eyes, the desperate belief that maybe, just maybe, I'd tell her I was ready to try again. "I've been thinking a lot," I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "About us, about everything that's happened." She nodded, waiting, her fingers trembling. "I love you, Emily. I probably always will, but I can't keep doing this." Her face crumpled, and she covered her mouth with her hands, muffling a sob. "Please," she whispered, "please don't say that. We can fix this. I know we can." I shook my head, the ache in my chest almost unbearable. "You broke something in me, Emily, something I don't think can ever be put back together. I can forgive you for what you did, but I can't forget it. And I can't live like this, always wondering, always doubting. It's not fair to either of us." She cried then, the kind of deep, wrenching sobs that tore at my resolve. But I didn't let myself waver. I'd made my decision, and as much as it hurt, I knew it was the right one. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork and difficult conversations. Telling friends and family, dividing up our life together, it was like dismantling a house we'd built brick by brick. Some days, it felt like I couldn't breathe under the weight of it all. But other days, I felt a strange sense of relief. I threw myself back into work, grateful for the distraction. The firehouse became my sanctuary again, a place where the chaos around me felt manageable, where I could focus on saving others instead of trying to salvage my own life. Outside of work, I found solace in my garage. The Mustang, neglected during the worst of it, became my therapy. I spent hours under the hood, the familiar rhythm of the tools grounding me in a way nothing else could. I reconnected with old friends, people I'd drifted away from over the years. I joined a local car club, something I'd always meant to do but never found the time for. Slowly, I started to rediscover parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. One evening, at a car meet, I struck up a conversation with someone new. She wasn't like Emily. Her laugh was louder, her energy infectious. We talked about cars, about life, about everything and nothing. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was hope. As the months passed, the pain of what happened began to fade. It didn't disappear, I don't think it ever will, but it became something I could carry without it weighing me down. I started to see our marriage not as a failure, but as a chapter in my life, one that taught me lessons I hadn't wanted to learn but needed to. Emily and I exchanged a few texts here and there, mostly logistical things about the divorce. She asked if we could meet, just to talk, but I told her it wasn't a good idea. I think she understood, even if it hurt her. One night, sitting in my garage with the Mustang's engine rumbling softly, I realized I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel sad either. I just felt at peace. Life didn't look the way I thought it would, but maybe that wasn't a bad thing. I had my work, my friends, my car. I had new goals, new dreams, and the freedom to chase them. As I turned off the engine and stepped out into the cool night air, I looked up at the stars and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The past would always be a part of me, but it didn't define me. I was moving forward, one step at a time, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. What do you think? Did I handle this the right way? Was exposing him and walking away from her the right choice? Or was there another path I should have taken? I keep asking myself if there's something I missed, some way I could have saved, what we had without losing myself in the process. Maybe you've been through something similar, or maybe you just have some advice. If you were in my shoes, what would you have done? Let me know. I could really use some perspective.